Welcome to Chicago Books. My guest is William S. Bike. He's the author of a book, Streets of the Near West Side. Bill, we'll start right in. First of all, you also are a columnist, or have been a columnist, for a paper called the Near West Side Gazette. And you're associate director or director at the School of Dentistry at the University of Illinois at Chicago. We'll get back to the dentistry part in UIC, but tell us how this book came about. I mean, I know that it's the columns at the Near West Side Gazette.
Well, the Near West Gazette started in 1983, and I've been the associate editor of the publication ever since then. And it's a monthly publication, and so both myself and the editor-in-chief, Mark Valentino, as well as the rest of the staff, have always worked full-time jobs elsewhere, and so we've done the Near West Gazette on the side. And so since it's a monthly publication, I started writing a monthly column called Streets of the Near West Side, in which I'd take a street in the area and write about who the street was named after. And I wrote the columns for about 10 years, from about 1983 to about 1992, until I sort of ran out of streets. And it was a real popular feature in the paper. People would look forward to it. And I just got the idea because, you know, people live on streets and work on streets and never really think about who they're named for. But, you know, every street in the city is named for an individual or a place or an event. And a lot of them have really interesting and sort of quirky stories, and so I started writing the column.
And the Near West Side is a old part of the city, and a very interesting one, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of history there.
Yes, it is. It's one of the oldest parts of the city, and it's actually the part of the city that's always been the gateway to immigration in the city. People are very familiar with Maxwell Street, and that's where a lot of the immigrant groups started out in Chicago. So, you know, the Near West Side, up until recently, now the Near West Side is sort of a gentrified area, but it had been a predominantly Italian area before that, and is still highly Italian. There's the famous Taylor Street that's the main thoroughfare of the Near West Side. But before that, it was the, you know, gateway area for the Poles to come into Chicago, and for the Germans, and for the Jewish population. So it is one of the oldest areas of the city, and it's got one of the richest histories, and that's why it was a lot of fun to write about it.
Well, it's pretty much the case with the naming of most streets, that they're named for politicians, bankers, and realtors. Is that the case in the Near West Side?
Pretty much. You know, there are a few streets that aren't named, you know, for those individuals, but, you know, there very often is a political reason for naming something after someone who's not a politician or a banker or a real estate agent. For example, there's May Street, and May actually sort of has two origins. You know, kind of the public...
Certain ambiguity about the name of the street.
Exactly,
right?
And there's a couple of them like that. But the city council ostensibly named it after the Mayflower, the ship that brought the Pilgrims over. But at the time, there was a Mayor Curtis, and his daughter was named May, and so they kind of thought if they named the street May, it would kind of, you know, make the mayor happy, so that's why they did that. So,
was there any reference? I mean, where did you find the reference to Mayflower then?
Well, the city has pretty good records, and I did a lot of my research in the mid-1980s down at City Hall, and that was kind of interesting in itself, because they had a card catalog at the time that listed the origins of street names, and if it had an ambiguity like the one I mentioned about May, you know, they had a little bit of information about a story like that. But it was the type of information that people didn't really, you know, need to look at that often. So the card catalog was actually located behind a photocopy machine in City Hall. So whenever I had to go down there and do the research, I kind of had to twist and turn around the Xerox machine to be able to get the information. So, you know, not something that people, you know, went down there to check out a lot, but they had good records down there.
And DePaul has a book, as you're familiar with it, Streets of the Chicago area. But you were doing your column way before that book came out, wasn't it?
Right.
Or was it Loyola?
Yeah, there's a book called Streetwise Chicago out, and a couple of fellows printed it through Loyola University Press. But yeah, I had started my column in 1983. I had read Streetwise Chicago, and it's a very good book with, you know, about 2 or 3 paragraph explanations of who the streets are named for. I wanted to go...
Painter and McNamee, right?
Right, exactly. I wanted to go into a little more depth since I was writing the columns in the Near West Gazette. Each one was the size of a normal news story, you know, from about 750 to 1,000 words. Some of the columns in my book are actually shorter because I shortened some of them up, and some of the streets didn't have particularly interesting backgrounds, but some of them really did, and so I wanted to give like a fuller explanation of how the streets came to be named what they were. And then also in my book, I've added some information about news that's happened on those streets over the last 15 years since we've been publishing the Near West Gazette.
Well, it's a marvelous way to publicize and get on the map, in a sense, a geographic, political area, isn't it? I mean, the whole notion.
It really is. You know, people ask me if I'm going to do books about other neighborhoods in Chicago, and, you know, while I'd love to, because I'm certainly, you know, fascinated by Chicago history, since it took me 10 years to write this one, I don't know if I'll be able to do every neighborhood in the city. Yeah,
well, that's a big challenge. Besides, you need a newspaper in every... Pretty much, don't you? I mean, you haven't got the constituency in the Near West Side Gazette.
Exactly.
Well, the Near West Side Gazette is an interesting story. I mean, when did it start originally, the earlier version?
There was an earlier version called the Near West Side Gazette that started in the 1960s and operated until about 1971. And one of the individuals involved in that was a gentleman named Dismas Fernandez, who was a Near West Side resident. The Near West Side Gazette went out of business in 1971, and the neighborhood actually had no newspaper between 1971 and 1983. Now, it's a neighborhood that really needs a newspaper because there's so much news going on in the area. It's very close to the Loop, and so there was a lot of gentrification going on, particularly beginning in the 1980s. The University of Illinois at Chicago is located on the Near West Side. The Illinois Medical District is there, so Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Hospital is there, UIC's hospital, the West Side VA Hospital is there. So there was a lot of activity in the neighborhood with the governmental entities and the medical entities that were already there. And then with the gentrifiers coming in too, there was a big battle between the gentrifiers and the people of predominantly Italian and Hispanic heritage who were living there at the time. And so I had met the gentleman who decided to start the new Near West Gazette, Mark Valentino, when we were both students at DePaul University. I was the editor of the DePaulia, and then he was the editor of the DePaulia, the student newspaper, about 2 years later. And a couple years after we graduated, he decided to start the new Near West Gazette in his own neighborhood, and so he invited me to be one of the associate editors, and he also brought on Dismas Fernandez, who had worked for the original Near West Side Gazette. And
that's sort of folded in conjunction with the creation of the University of Illinois at Chicago? I mean, was that parallel there?
Well, the University of Illinois at Chicago, you know, really the big controversy was in the 1960s, and I think that's when the original Near West Side Gazette started out.
I see.
By the time, you know, the 1980s rolled around, the University of Illinois at Chicago was certainly well established, but there was the big battle between the gentrifiers and the traditional residents, and would the neighborhood be gentrified? Would there be, you know, housing for the traditional residents, the lower income residents? And so, you know, the battles between the gentrifiers and the older residents was the way we started out.
Right. During the course of the years, over the course of the years, street names get changed. I mean, realtors are somehow forgotten, or bankers. And there are other ones. There are political controversies. For example, a naming of a street after the southern plantation of a Kentucky general or whatever. They get changed to Union Street, for example. What are some of the things that surprised you the most in your research on street names? Well,
for example, you know, you referred to naming a street for a southern plantation. That's Ashland, and you know, I figured it might have been named for an ash tree or something like that, but once you get into the research, you find out that the stories are a lot more interesting and a lot more quirky. And so Ashland, for example, was named Reuben Street, and it was named after a fellow named Reuben Taylor, who was a real estate developer and a philanthropist, and you know, kind of a upper-class society individual in Chicago in the mid-19th century. And so Ashland Avenue on the Near West Side at the time was sort of Chicago's Gold Coast, where all the best mansions were. But right off of Ashland, where the side streets where all the poor people lived, and so the poor people would come over to Reuben Street and kind of have their fun insulting the rich people who lived there by calling them rubes, exactly. And so that was a big insult in the 19th century, and so the people living in the mansions decided they didn't want to be called rubes by the poor people of the near west side anymore. So they petitioned the city council to change the name, and they chose Ashland, which was the name of the mansion owned by Henry Clay, the politician from Kentucky. And many of the people who were well-to-do and living on Ashland had come from Kentucky, and so that's why they were able to. That's why they suggested Ashland for that.
And the name Taylor, there was already another Taylor, and this was a different Taylor, so they didn't want to confuse.
Exactly.
So they named it after his first name, Reuben.
Exactly. You know, and also Paulina is named after Reuben Taylor's wife, Paulina Taylor. So there's a lot of street names.
So she still got her name, but it was shortened when the
still got her
University
name.
Cook County Hospital bought that street up. That's not in your book, is it? I mean,
yeah, that's some of the things, you know, there's so much news that's happened in that area in the last 15 years, and there is part of Paulina a little bit south of the Eisenhower Expressway where Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's kind of blocked it off, and it was a big controversy at the time, but there's a lot of
street story, though.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you know, one thing I've actually found since the book has been out is that everybody's got a story that they would have liked to have seen in the book. You know, I think I'm gathering enough stories to be able to publish a second book. So for example, the Chicago Cubs used to play on the near west side at Polk and Walcott, and the expression out in left field comes from there because actually the insane asylum was outside of the ballpark across the street from left field. Yeah. And so, you know, the expression out in left field meant kind of crazy, and that actually comes from the near west side itself. And that was a story, you know, I hadn't heard that until, you know, the book came out.
I thought it was just another slam at lefties. It's not, though. How about Rube? I mean, that predates Reuben Street, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, definitely. So it kind of meshed real well since the rich folks lived on Reuben Street. There was already like a ready-made insult for the poor people too.
Which street do you think is most aptly named, or did you enjoy the name more? So I mean, there are many ones that are for anonymous almost to us today figures, although you've brought them to light in your book. But which street do you say this is poetic or political justice here? I like this.
You know, I don't know if it's, you know, appropriate, but one of the most ironic ones I think is Bowler Street, and that's named after a politician named James Bowler. He was an alderman for most of the century, and then he became a congressman in the 1950s. And when he was a congressman in the 1950s, he was one of the congressmen who was most responsible for creating the interstate highway system, which created the Eisenhower Expressway, for example. And Bowler was a bicycle racer when he was a young man, a professional bicycle racer. So I thought it was really ironic that a bicycle racer would be the one of the fellows who invented the interstate highway system. And I thought that it was also appropriate to name a street for Bowler because he actually lived on the near west side. You know, some of these streets, you know, go all the way across the city, and a lot of them are named for presidents, so, you know, they don't always have a connection to the near west side or Chicago, but Bowler lived right on the near west side, represented the near west side in the city council for about 40 years, and so that one I thought was particularly appropriate to name a street in his own neighborhood for him.
And how long does it take generally before a street is named? Not an honorary street, but a street, would you say, after a person has deceased or disappeared from the scene?
Well, sometimes they don't even disappear from the scene. You know, for example, when they were naming streets in the 19th century, a lot of them would be named for real estate developers who just named their own streets after themselves because they would buy an area and subdivide it. So it really depends sort of on the era and how quickly the city council decides to move. And now, of course, there's a lot more input from the neighbors. You know, I remember a few years ago that the street that Nelson Algren lived on, Evergreen, up in Wicker Park, the city council actually wanted to rename it Algren, and not an honorary name, but actually a real renaming of the street. And the people who lived there actually got up in arms because they felt they would have to change their driver's licenses, and if they had stationery, they'd have to change their stationery, and they felt it would be too confusing. So actually the city council wanted to do it, and the neighbors got all up in arms and stopped them from doing it. So when the city council came up with the idea of honorary streets, then they just honorarily named it after Ogren. So now I think it's almost virtually impossible to change the actual name of the street, but that's what the honorary street names do.
Really? Have you kept track over the years of the honorary streets, and especially on the near west side?
That's kind of a funny thing, because there's so many honorary streets popping up, and there's a lot of them on the near west side too. And occasionally we will cover when they rename a street after somebody from the neighborhood, but sometimes you'll just see a street sign pop up and you have no idea, not only where the idea came from, but even who the individual is. So, I think that's probably a worthy subject for a future book, is to write about all the honorary streets in Chicago, because they're all over the place now.
Well, let's go down some of the streets. One of the interesting ones, as many of them are, really, Dekoven. Tell us about the history of Dekoven Street.
Well,
on the near west side.
Dekoven Street, of course, was where the Great Chicago Fire started. And so in my book, I talk less about who the street is named after, but, the Great Chicago Fire, how it started. Everyone's heard the legend of Mrs. O'Leary's cow. If you delve into it a little bit deeper, there was actually an individual who may have been a drifter, or may have been a workman, who probably, started the fire in the barn, maybe, kicking over a lantern, or maybe smoking or something like that. And so the legend was kind of created as a cover story, because this fellow, would have been lynched if, the story would have gotten out that he had actually started the fire. So that's kind of...
So the poor family lived in infamy for 40 years as a cover story.
Exactly.
Or more than 40.
Yeah, it did start in their...
One son went mad, and...
Yeah, it did start in their barn, but they didn't, they had nothing to do with starting the fire. It had been an incredibly hot and dry summer,
right.
And, the fire had started there. But there's another legend pertaining to the Chicago fire that is also mentioned in my book. Damon Avenue is named after Father Arnold Damon, who started Loyola University on the near west side of Chicago as St. Ignatius College. And the legend has it, this was 1871, and St. Ignatius College had just been built in 1869, and Holy Family Church next door just a couple of years before. So Holy Family was the largest Catholic church in Chicago at the time, and St. Ignatius College was the first Catholic college in Chicago. And so when the fire started, it started a little bit east of the St. Ignatius Holy Family complex, and it was moving right towards the complex. And so Father Damon was actually one of the top orators in the United States in the 19th century, and he was giving a talk in Brooklyn. So someone actually telegraphed Father Damon in Brooklyn, saying that the city was on fire and the flames were approaching the complex. So the legend has it that Father Damon prayed that the flames would spare the new college and the church, and that's exactly what happened. The flames were moving east and north, and they kept moving north, but they stopped moving east, and so St. Ignatius College and Holy Family Church didn't burn down, and in fact they're still there today.
And that is in the book?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Some of the ones, Congress Parkway, tell us a story about that.
Yeah, that's
a good story.
That's an interesting one. A lot of the streets on the near west side are named for presidents, and there was a president, John Tyler, who had served in the 1840s, and he was from Virginia. And Tyler was still around in the late 1850s and early 1860s. And since Tyler was a Southerner, when the Southern states seceded from the Union, when the Civil War began, Tyler was actually pro-South, and he had actually got elected to the Confederate House of Representatives. So in 1872, a few years after the Civil War was over, the city council decided to rename Tyler Street because they didn't want the street named after a Southern sympathizer. There was still a lot of anti-Southern feeling in Chicago at the time, and so they renamed it Congress Street. So Tyler is one of the presidents who served in the 1840s who kind of lost his street name on the
really?
west side.
It's really ironic, isn't it, that with the sort of democratization that goes on, I mean, the input from the public, in some senses, there is a lessening of democracy in terms of the street representation. because for various pragmatic reasons, you don't really want it because license plates or licenses and so forth.
Exactly. So I think you know, we're kind of stuck with a lot of the street names we have now.
Even though it's basically, you know, bankers and realtors. And, yeah. In many cases. Taylor
Street is the most famous street on the Near West Side, and it's named after President Zachary Taylor. But a couple of years ago, since some of the gentrifiers in the neighborhood call the neighborhood the University Village area, there was actually some agitation to change the name of Taylor Street to University Village Avenue, but the older residents didn't like that too much, and the city council isn't in the business of changing street names anymore, so Taylor Street it's been, and Taylor Street it's going to stay for a while.
Really? You don't see too many changes in the works then. Harrison Street, that's an interesting street. Tell us about that.
Harrison Street is named after another president of the United States, William Henry Harrison, and he was kind of an interesting individual because he had actually served as president the shortest time of any president. He gave the longest inaugural speech in history, and the day he was inaugurated was a rainy, snowy, cold day. And yeah, he caught a cold when he gave his inaugural speech and only served for a month, and he was sick all that time and died a month later. And that's actually when Tyler became president. And so Tyler was actually the first vice president to become president, and Tyler kind of made that decision on his own because when it happened, nobody really knew what to do. You know, they didn't know if he was the vice president but the acting president, and Tyler, you know, was the type of guy who said, well, I'm the president of the United States now, and they kind of went along with it. But, you know, Harrison, another interesting thing about Harrison, he was the oldest person elected president at the time until Ronald Reagan. And so, you know, in doing my research, you know, I kind of came up with a lot of parallels between Harrison and Reagan. You know, Harrison was a popular figure because he was a general, and Reagan was a popular figure, you know, not necessarily because of his political background, because he was, you know, well known as an actor, of course. And, you know, Harrison also had run the first image-oriented campaign rather than issue-oriented, where, you know, Harrison, they really played up the fact that he was born in a log cabin, and that's the phrase Tippecanoe in Tyler 2 comes from there, because Harrison, as a general, had won the Battle of Tippecanoe, and so it was just a real exciting, fun type of campaign, and that's the kind of campaigns that Ronald Reagan would run, you know, a lot of flags, a lot of balloons, things like that, and so, you know, you do the historical research and really come up with some interesting parallels like that.
Right, yeah. Another plantation, a southern plantation, Andrew Jackson's Hermitage. How did that get named, do you know?
Well, Jackson was one of the most popular presidents of the 19th century, and since most of these streets in the area were named in the 19th century, Jackson was still popular. So Jackson actually gets two on the Near West Side because he's got Jackson Boulevard and he's got Hermitage, and Hermitage was named after his plantation down in Tennessee. And so, you know, even then, Chicago was a pretty Democratic city, and Jackson was a Democratic president, and so they decided to, you know, honor Andrew Jackson twice instead of just once.
Were there any surprises in terms of the politics? Anybody left out that you thought, well, this is odd. Why haven't we got, you know, some odd street? Anything?
You know,
comes to mind?
Since a lot of the streets are, you know, the east-west streets are named after presidents. You know, they really didn't, you know, leave anybody out in that particular time period. You know, they picked the presidents from about, you know, maybe the 1820s through the 1850s. So the consecutive president.
Is it straight through? I thought there was one guy that was left out. One president.
You know, there might be. It kind of escapes me at this point, and then Tyler, of course, is left out because he used to be Congress.
Yeah.
But it ends at Fillmore. Fillmore was president in the early 1850s, and the next president was a fellow named Franklin Pierson, and they stopped naming the streets after presidents. So, you know, after the consecutive ones, you know, there's kind of presidential streets all over. Like, for example, Roosevelt Road used to be 12th Street, and Roosevelt Road is actually named for Theodore Roosevelt, who was a popular president at the beginning of the century. And so, you know, after he passed away, the city council decided to change the name of 12th Street to Roosevelt Road. So That, I think, is about, the only possibility of street names being changed in Chicago is the ones that are numbered and aren't named for anybody anyway. There still might be some possibilities out there. I wouldn't be surprised if, we see a street named for Cardinal Bernardine one of these days. So if they're going to...
A real street, not on
I would think a real street, yeah. I think, he's certainly popular enough right now that that's something that we might see.
How about poets? I mean, there's a good number of poets that Illinois has. How have they fared? Nelson Algren didn't do too well.
Yeah, Nelson Algren didn't do too well. Actually, Racine is named after a French poet, so, actually...
That's a strange, out-of-nowhere name. What's the story behind that?
Well, I think because actually that area was a French part of Chicago, and you don't really think of Chicago having French neighborhoods because there aren't any French neighborhoods anymore. But in the last century, like I said, that area of the city was the gateway to the city for all the immigrant groups, and so that was actually a very French area. So Notre Dame de Chicago Parish, which is on Flournoy, was actually started out as a French parish, and so that's why it has the name that it does. So I think because it was a French neighborhood, somebody decided to name Racine after one of the French poets, Racine.
I see. And women haven't fared too well, except as daughters of realtors and such. How have they done, especially on the Near West Side?
I think they've actually done kind of okay on the Near West Side. There's a street called Ada, and it's named for a woman named Ada Sawyer Garrett. And her grandfather was a fellow named Butterfield, who was a judge. And so Butterfield's daughters were called the Beautiful Butterfield Girls, and they were kind of like the...
Sounds like a poem out of Dylan Thomas, doesn't it? Butterfield Fat Goose Girls.
Well, the Butterfield girls were actually like the cream of Chicago society in the 19th century, and kind of like if there were gossip columns at the time, I think they'd always be mentioned in the gossip columns. And so Mrs. Garrett was one of the daughters of one of the Butterfield girls, and so she outlived her husband a very long time, and so she spent most of the early part of this century managing her money, and so he had left her comfortable but not particularly rich, and when she died during the Great Depression, she had left, I think, about $2.25 million, which, in Depression era dollars is probably worth about $20 million now, and it was all, her own financial acumen. So she got a street named after her. I think they were pretty impressed by the fact that, somebody could make that much money during the Depression. So, there's Ada Street, there's May Street, there's, Paulina. So usually the women are the husband of somebody else. At the time, women's role in society was, pretty much relegated to being, in high society. And so a few of the streets were named after the high society ladies.
Mm-hmm. But how about Adams, Jane Addams? I mean, is there a street?
Not a street for Jane Addams, but Adams Street is actually named after, it's named after President John Quincy Adams. There were two presidents named Adams. There was John Adams and John Quincy Adams. John Quincy was John Adams' son. And that was one of the more fun stories in the book, rather than, just all the stodgy stuff that, you got names and dates when you were in high school. I tried to, pick out some of the more interesting stories about the presidents. And John Quincy Adams was sort of a stodgy, stuffy guy, but one thing he liked to do when he was president of the United States is get up at about 4 in the morning and go down to the Potomac River and swim in the nude. And that was the way he exercised every day. So there's a story where a female reporter had been trying to get an interview with the president, and he refused to give her one, and so she followed him down to the riverfront one early morning and sat on his clothes and refused to give him his clothes back until he gave her an interview, so she got the interview that she wanted.
By the riverside.
Mm-hmm.
What was the nature of the questions? What were?
Well, I
have
just,
any idea what
I think
what magazine was this anyway?
I think it was a Washington newspaper, and just the fact that there was a female reporter in the 1820s was kind of unusual enough, and I think he just didn't want to talk to her because he probably didn't consider her a serious journalist like the men, but so she was clever enough to get an interview with the president.
Had you done much history? What's your background in school?
I was a political science major, and actually my junior year in high school was when we studied American history. And at the time, Watergate was going on, and so it was really interesting to me to be reading about American history and sort of living American history at the same time. You know, it was a great time to be learning American history. So, you know, I really got interested in it, and so when I went to DePaul, I majored in political science. And so when you study political science, there's obviously a lot of history involved. So I've always just been real interested in history. So even when I was at DePaul, I wrote a column in the student newspaper called Blast from the Past, where I would research things sort of like this, you know, who buildings were named after, because, you know, people go to the same building every day for 4 years, and it's called, you know, the Schmidt Academic Center or something like that, and people have no idea who it's named after. So I would write columns about who the buildings were named after at DePaul, and interesting events that had happened at DePaul over the years. And most universities have a really good archive about themselves, so I learned to use the archive at DePaul. And then I also, later on, I worked as publications director at Loyola University for many years, and so I got really familiar with the archives at Loyola, which are also very good, and actually did a lot of the research for my book at Loyola University's libraries. So if you're an American history buff or Chicago history buff, Loyola is a pretty good library that a lot of people probably don't know about, you know, with a really good collection of Chicago history.
Really? Are there, back to the streets business a little bit, are there streets that you think, well, this is a prime street that the name ought to be changed, that we ought to honor somebody, say Gwendolyn Brooks or somebody, Loomis Street, for example, something like that. Nobody remembers too much except for you.
Yeah. You know, nobody remembers these individuals, but, you know, the streets, you know, often were named that way for a reason other than the fact that the fellow named it for himself if he was a real estate developer. And, you know, I kind of like the street names named as they are. I'm actually in favor of the honorary, you know, changing, because, you know, it kind of fits in, you know, what Nelson Algren's neighbors wanted, you know, where, you know, don't really have to change everybody's driver's license and mail and stuff like that, but yet you do get to honor an individual who, you know, either lived in that area or was very influential in that area. So, you know, being a history buff as I am, I kind of like things the way they are, and I'm glad the City Council came up with the idea of the honorary street names. Right. I think there might be a little too many of them now. You know, kind of anywhere you go, you know, you see the honorary street names. But I think if you know, there was maybe like a plaque on the streets or something saying who these honorary individuals were, you know, I think that would give people a little more appreciation of the history of their own neighborhoods. Right.
Well, a couple more streets I want to ask you, but I just want to say we're talking to Bill Bike. He's the author of The Streets of the Near West Side. We have an address where people can get a copy of the book, or a phone number where they can call, and it's published by ACTA Publications here in Chicago. One of the streets that is intriguing to me especially is the Sangamon Street. Sangamon. Tell us the story about that street.
Yeah, you know, there are a few streets, you know, with Indian names, and Sangamon is one of them. And the word Sagamo sort of means chief in the Algonquinian languages, and so, you know, Sangamon is kind of a corruption of that. And you'll find that too, for example, that, you know, the people who settled couldn't quite pronounce the Indian names right, or couldn't quite pronounce names right from foreign languages, and so some of the streets in Chicago actually are a little bit of a corruption of an original word, but that's one of the streets in the area that kept its original Indian name.
And another one, Washburn. Interesting story about Washburn Street.
Yeah, that was, Elihu Washburn was an individual who was a politician in Illinois, and he ended up being a congressman, but he was a close friend of Abraham Lincoln, and he was also the fellow who suggested to the Illinois State Legislature that they name Ulysses Grant a general, because at the time, like, Grant had been in the regular U.S. Army and had retired, and he was working as a farmer in Illinois, and not being very successful at it either. But anybody with military experience, once the Civil War started, you know, was called up to, you know, fight for the North. And so Washburn was somebody who knew Grant and suggested that he be named a general. And so that's the reason Grant went from, you know, rather poor dirt farmer to general in one leap, because you know, Washburn knew that he could handle the job, and Washburn was exactly right, because Abraham Lincoln had gone through many generals before he found Ulysses Grant, who could actually lead the Northern troops to victory. But Washburn had been a friend of Lincoln's. I think he even beat Lincoln out for a political office one time. So it's a rather small street, but a big individual.
And this phenomenon of state legislatures naming generals, I mean, what you have there is state armies, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. The state militias, and so the states would name generals. And so actually, the troops during the Civil War were, Illinois brigades and Massachusetts brigades and regiments and things like that. And, it's something we don't have anymore, but at the time the United States really didn't have a standing army. And so if they needed to create an army, they went to the states, and the state legislatures had to do it.
Any other remarks about some of the streets? I mean, you concentrate on the streets of a specific area in Chicago, the near west side. Any other stories that strike you as particularly intriguing?
One of my favorite streets is Taylor Street, and everybody has heard of Taylor Street because it is the main thoroughfare on the near west side, and particularly people of Italian heritage know Taylor Street because it's always been sort of the capital of the Italian neighborhood. But I bet most people don't know it's named after Zachary Taylor, who's sort of an obscure president these days, but actually has sort of an interesting story, because Taylor was president. He got elected in 1848, and so he was president in 1850 when Congress passed the Compromise of 1850. And what the Compromise of 1850 was, the South was agitating about slavery and was threatening to secede from the Union, and so the Compromise of 1850 was a bunch of laws that were designed to both placate the South and placate the North, too. So it was kind of a compromise thing. There was something in there for everybody. But Taylor, who was actually a Southerner, he was from Louisiana, and he was a slaveholder too, but once he became president, wasn't really in favor of doing anything for the South, and in fact, sort of became against slavery. And so a group of Southern congressmen came to see Taylor and asked him what he was going to do on the Compromise of 1850, and Taylor said he was going to veto those laws. And so the Southern congressmen said, well, then the South is going to secede. And Taylor said, go ahead, because I'm ready to lead the troops. Because Taylor, before he was president, had been a general, and the top general in the Mexican War in the mid-1840s. And so had Taylor lived, you'd have had the interesting phenomenon that we had never had in the United States of the President of the United States actually leading the troops of the United States in battle. So literally taking his role as commander-in-chief, very literally. And so had Taylor lived, he would have led the United States troops in battle against the South, and probably the Civil War not only would have happened 10 years earlier, but would have been a lot shorter, because Taylor was a great general, and Lincoln's problem until he found Grant was that he didn't have any good generals. So Zachary Taylor might occupy the place in American history that Abraham Lincoln occupies today, meaning the president who ended the Civil War and kept the Union together. Taylor had...
Do his writings and insights sort of parallel that too? I mean,
definitely.
Depth and insightfulness of Lincoln?
Yeah, Taylor, was a much more complex individual than history gives him credit for. And there was a biography of Taylor written a couple of years ago, a new biography of Taylor. And that's one of those quirky anecdotes that's in the book too, because actually the author had suggested that Taylor may have been murdered rather than dying of natural causes. And so around 1991, the family actually agreed, and Taylor, who had been dead for 140 years, they actually exhumed his body and ran some medical tests on him to see if he had been poisoned or not, and they didn't find any. And so they figured that the legend of his death was actually true, which was that in July of 1850, he was dedicating the base of the Washington Monument. The monument wasn't finished until like the 1870s, but it was begun in 1850, and it was a very hot July day in Washington, D.C., and Taylor went back to the White House and ate some ice cream and cherries, and he got a severe case of indigestion, and he died from it. And so, because of
gastroenteritis?
Yeah, exactly. So because of a wayward bowl of ice cream and cherries, the entire history of the United States took a turn in direction, because Millard Fillmore, who was Taylor's vice president, succeeded Taylor once Taylor had died, and Fillmore signed the bills of the Compromise of 1850, and they had averted the Civil War for another 10 years. So Taylor Street is not only the main thoroughfare in the area, but has one of the quirkiest backgrounds too.
Wasn't Taylor the one who fought using non-uniforms? He fought in a business suit?
Yeah, exactly. Taylor, was thought of as one of those generals who got elected president, but he was actually kind of a quirky individual, and so he never actually led the troops in a military uniform. He would either wear a business suit or farm clothing. And so, there are anecdotes about that. Like one time Taylor had left the camp, and when he came back, the sentries didn't want to let him in because they just saw this guy wearing, a farmer's outfit and figured he had no business being in the Army camp. And there's another incident where Taylor was going to have a meeting with another general who was really known for spit and polish and shiny brand new uniform and things like that. So Taylor decided that to honor this other general, he would actually wear a uniform to this meeting, and the other general figured that, to make Taylor comfortable, he would just wear, a business suit or something like that. So you had the quirky situation of Taylor dressed up in a uniform that he never wore, and the other general dressed up in a business suit that he never wore to have this meeting, so they had a big laugh about that. Another thing about Taylor, at the time when he was nominated for president, presidential candidates actually didn't go to the nominating conventions. They were informed by letter that they had been nominated by their party. And so Taylor was a member of the Whig Party, which was the precursor to the Republican Party. And when the Whig Party nominated him, they sent him a letter, but they sent it postage due. And Taylor had decided that he was getting too much postage due mail and didn't want to pay for it anymore, so he sent the letter back. So they actually, had to send him another letter and put a stamp on it and let him know that he'd gotten the nomination for the presidency. And so, I can't imagine any candidate these days sending the news back because he had to pay 2 cents for it.
Right. Well, marvelous. Thank you, Bill. We've been talking to Bill Bike. He is the author of Streets of the Near West Side. It's a story of the streets of the Near West Side and the history that's behind them. And it's a marvelous little history book with a lot of anecdotes that you don't normally pick up. It's a great little book. Published by Acta Press. What's the phone number? And the price is $8.95?
Price is $8.95. It's being distributed by a company called A&B Communications, and the phone number is area code 773-866-0024. And if you let A&B know, I'll autograph the book too.
Marvelous. Okay. Well, thanks again, Bill.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you for watching Chicago Books. Well, thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Of all the rambling around I've done, walking around from town to town, the sweetest breeze to blow me down was in old Chicago, where stock train runs at midnight, milk truck runs at daylight, where the folks don't sleep at all in old Chicago. Old Chicago, round the lake, round where the girls go, where the breeze come here to blow in old Chicago. Old Chicago, round the lake, round where the girls go, where the breeze come